Welcome to World War II, Both Sides of the Wire, the podcast where we lift the lid, bust the myths, and explore the incredible history of the Second World War from the Allied and Axis perspectives. I'm Jesse Alexander, a public historian specializing in the history of the two world wars.
And I am Matthias Strohn, German officer, professor of military studies, and author. In this episode, we take a closer look at Operation Barbarossa, the German invasion of the Soviet Union in 1941. It was the largest campaign in the history of warfare, and the one that arguably turned the tide and decided the outcome of the Second World War. Why did the Germans decide to invade? What were the Soviets' countermoves? And why did the Wehrmacht fail? Hi Jesse, good to see and hear you again. Here we are for yet another episode. This is another big one. It's a big campaign. I already mentioned it in the intro sentence. So lots to talk about today. Again, busting the myths around this particular campaign, as we always do on this particular podcast. And I personally think before we really dive in and start discussing the campaign itself, we need to talk a little bit about the background and the context. Why did the Germans invade? What were their ideas? And how did they then turn all this into the operational plan? So maybe we start perhaps a little bit with the ideology and why Hitler was so keen on invading the Soviet Union. So Jesse, what are your thoughts on this?
Yeah, hi Matthias. We've bitten off as much as we can chew yet again. I don't know, it seems like they do war in Eastern Europe like they do everything else in Texas, which is on a grand, huge scale. In this case, far more tragic, of course. But yeah, I mean, Barbarossa, one of the most important clashes in recorded history. And it was a long time in the making, right? I think if we look at the origins of it, we've got to go back farther past the initial, or let's say the final planning stages where they're saying, well, which army group will do this and which will be our objective. We'll get to that stage, of course, that begins more or less in detail in 1940. But this desire for turning east in a military sense goes a long way back. I mean, of course, you can take it back to the 1920s in Mein Kampf, where Hitler's articulating some of his ideology about Lebensraum for the German race. It's going to be conquered in the East, but it goes even farther back than that. You might take it back to the 18th century settlements of Germans throughout the former Russian Empire and even the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. You might even take it back to the legends and the cultural meaning in Germany throughout the centuries of the medieval clashes between the Teutonic Knights and Poles, or between Teutonic Knights and medieval Russian hero Alexander Nevsky, and so on. So there's a huge background, which you, Matthias, as a German, are probably better versed in than I am, as a Johnny-come-lately to the German cultural scene from Canada. So take us through a few of those, like the deeper roots, let's say, of German aspirations in the East.
These roots really do run deep. You've already mentioned the centuries, you've mentioned some of these names, and you're absolutely spot on. You really have to go back to the Middle Ages to understand what is going on there and why the Germans have this drive to the east. There's a German term for Drang nach Osten, which was the driving idea for centuries. So it's all about going into the East, controlling the East. And it really, really starts in the 8th or 9th century. We don't want to make a podcast about medieval history, but this is where it all starts. You can also see this played out in the naming of this operation. We return to the operational planning later on, but just to throw this out here. So the first draft of this operation was actually called Operation Otto. And Otto rings a bell in those days with most Germans because this is Otto the Great, who in the 10th century defeated the Hungarians as they were coming in from the east. Having done that, the Germans then start expanding. They start expanding into what then becomes Prussia. They go into, as you already said, into Poland. You've got the Teutonic Knights. So this is all there. And then, of course, you have another factor, which is also interesting here in this context, when you look at how and why the name gets changed of the operation. So from Otto, who you might say is he's defending against the Hungarians, who in those days, in the 10th century, were seen as the great menace of Europe. They were just invading left, right, and center. He defeats them, stops this advance, and then pushes German culture, German language further to the east. It then gets changed by Hitler himself to Operation Barbarossa. And Barbarossa, of course, is also an extremely famous person in German history and German mythology as well. So he's the emperor of the Holy Roman Empire in the 12th century. There's also this Drang nach Osten, the drive to the east, which he supports. And of course, he goes on a crusade. And he actually dies on the crusade while he's bathing in a river in Asia Minor, so basically modern-day Turkey. So you can see there's a bit of a shift here in the terminology from a more of a defensive stance to a more offensive one. And also, Barbarossa is very famous in German mythology because when he dies in Turkey in 1190, the idea is that he actually doesn't really die, but he comes back to Germany, goes to the Kyffhäuser Mountains, and that's where he sleeps in a cave with his knights. And in the time of dire need, he will come back, he will return, and he will save Germany. So this is folklore, this is a story, but everybody in those days knew that. So the moment you bring these things together, Drang nach Osten, expanding the German sphere of influence, culture is very important, plus this crusader aspect, you're already there. And again, when you look at the history even more, look at the Hanseatic League, for example. The Hanseatic League, which uses the law from Lübeck, it's a German city, which is destroyed by the Royal Air Force in the Second World War, that expands and takes, for example, the law and the people with it. And in the entire Baltic area, including the Baltic states, you have this law, you have German influence, you have the Baltic Germans, for example, who practically run the 3 Baltic states for centuries. So this is nothing new at that particular time. This is something that had always been in the minds of the Germans. The Germans seeing themselves very much as a bridge between the West, in particular those days there would have been France and the UK, and the East, which is, of course, Russia or then the Soviet Union. So this is where it all comes in.
I mean, I think, to be honest, the description as a bridge is, I think it's a part of it, there's no question, but they don't see themselves as an equal bridge, or they don't necessarily see themselves as equal to Eastern Europeans, or Eastern Europeans as equal to them in some cases. It's a dominant bridge in many cases. Yeah. And I think this starts to come into play as well, even in the First World War, when you have the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk, for example, where Russian Empire is defeated and the Germans and Austro-Hungarians decide to dominate Eastern Europe. And this is one of the major goals of the war that is achieved temporarily, at least. I also think it's interesting that you mentioned the Barbarossa, the medieval Barbarossa, dying in a river in the east. I mean, Hitler couldn't have known it, but that was a little bit prophetic, because there's a heck of a lot of Germans during the campaign who died near a river in the east. One of those weird ironies of delusions of grandeur, let's say. But what I also find interesting is that in spite of this background, where you have kind of political groupings in Eastern Europe, political groupings in Central Europe, sometimes it's Poland and a German state, Holy Roman Empire, sometimes it's Russian Empire and Wilhelmine Germany. There is that background, but it doesn't, of course, I just want to kind of point this out for our listeners out there, that doesn't mean that something like Barbarossa was inevitable. It means that there's a history of power politics between these two kind of imperial centers of power, if you will, clashing on the edges in Central Eastern Europe. But there's nothing inevitable about that. It's a policy choice that the Nazi government makes. And that is bound up with this ideological aspect. And I mentioned it, of course, in Mein Kampf. Hitler goes on and on and on about the superiority of the German race, the subhuman Slavs, and that there's going to be living space in the East where German settlers will replace Slavic population. Interestingly enough, in those medieval times, early medieval times, a huge chunk of even what is today Germany was populated by Slavs. And then in later medieval times, that started to shift through conquest, assimilation, and immigration as well. So let's fast forward here, because it would be awesome to have a 3-hour podcast on Barbarossa. We would probably lose half of you people out there in the intricacies of it. But let's fast forward to the years leading up to it. How does this happen? How does this genesis come? How is Hitler trying to make these decisions in the context of the war that does happen in 1939?
Well, you have, of course, you already mentioned it, ideology. And that for Hitler is the main driver. You talked about the racial superiority that he thought the Germanic or the Nordic race had. By the way, I once checked, I'm only a class 2 Aryan according to the Nazi regime, so I wouldn't have made it very, 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 very far into the top, but there we go. That plays a role. When you then take into consideration what's actually happening in places like the Soviet Union, it plays very, very nicely into the hand of Hitler's ideology. So if you follow the Nazi ideology, the Soviet Union is, of course, the perfect, well, let's call it victim, because you've got communism there. The Nazis don't like communism because it doesn't have the national aspect to it. You also have, of course, during the time of the Russian Revolution in 1917, and the years after that, you have a relatively high percentage of Jews in the leading ranks of the Bolsheviks. So in the Nazi ideology, this all suddenly makes sense. So you really need to fight against these guys because otherwise they are going to take over the world. So that is very, very important. It's also, for example, the Nazis always made that point that they're not only fighting for Germany, but they are fighting for what they would have called the freedom of Europe against communism, which was a propaganda phrase which is actually more successful in other European countries than people would admit to after the war.
They made that point a lot harder when they started losing in the East. It must also
Correct.
be said, but
Yep.
Go on.
Yeah. So that's that. That's ideology, and I think we all know a little bit about Nazi ideology. So let's leave it at that. But there are other factors that make this whole thing very important in the 1920s and in the 1930s. The build up to the war and the build up to this campaign, and this is in particular the legacy of the First World War. So whatever Germany does, even in the Weimar Republic, they're always looking back to the First World War and think, okay, where and how did it go wrong? Where do we need to be better? One point that is discussed a lot in German circles is, for example, the British blockade, which the numbers are still being debated. If you go to the high end, people have argued that up to 1 million civilians died because of the British blockade in Germany and the Austro-Hungarian Empire. So that's a high number. So they look at this and say, from a point of geopolitics and geostrategic thinking, we need to make sure that we become independent from imports via the sea. Because otherwise, the next war, which will happen, that's their conviction, their belief, the same will happen again. So where do you go when you look at the map? Where do you have lots of fertile lands? That's in the east. We then combine that with ideology and say, well, you only got, Slavs, subhumans, Untermenschen living there. Well, that is, you might say, from a Nazi perspective, the perfect combination. And this whole idea was actually relatively popular. And it's all linked to a man who's called Haushofer. He is the man, the founding father of this geopolitics. He is an officer in the First World War. He then becomes a university man. And he's actually one of the lecturers of Rudolf Hess, who then becomes the second man in the Nazi state. They become very good friends. He dedicates a book to Hess as well, which is in 1934, so after the Nazis have come to power, so probably for obvious reasons. But they were very, very close, and he influenced Hess a lot when it came to his geostrategic thinking. There's a bit of debate as to how much influence he had on Hitler, but you can see Haushofer's ideas and writing also in Nazi ideology. So, for example, he's the first one who uses and who actually coins the term of Lebensraum, living space. So that all goes back to him. And he, when you read his books, says all of these things because of the legacy, the lessons of and from the First World War.
I'm always a fan of bringing First World War context into the origins of any part of the Second World War. No question about that. Yes, there are huge debates about the blockade, especially now. There are kind of revisionist ideas that it didn't actually cause many of those deaths. But what's important, I think, is that in the interwar period, it was accepted, that argument, especially in Germany, that the blockade did cause those high numbers of death and did directly contribute as a primary factor to the defeat of Germany, along with the stab in the back myth, of course. Now, as we get closer, Hitler never wavers, right? In his idea that at some point there's going to be war in the East, even when the only shooting war is really going on in the West in 1939 and 1940. So, of course, there is this aspect of Hitler decides to kind of conveniently ally himself with the Soviet Union for the purpose of beginning the drive towards the east and attacking Poland. And soon after that, once France is defeated, then the real sort of detailed planning begins for the attack on the Soviet Union. While, of course, the Nazi-Soviet Pact, non-aggression pact, is still in force. So it's kind of the backstabbing is kind of going the other way in this case, one might say.
That is very, very true. And we mustn't forget, going back to Mein Kampf ideology and all these things we've already mentioned, in many ways, everything that Hitler does up until the 22nd of June 1941, when they finally invade the Soviet Union, is a bit of a detour. Poland is unfortunate because it is kind of in the way. Of course, there are also territories which everybody in Germany thought they should go back to Germany because they'd lost them to Poland after the First World War. And then, of course, France and Britain declare war, and Hitler has to deal with these things. But it's not the war that he wants. And he's very, very, very much set on going into the East. And with the benefit of hindsight, you might say, if he hadn't been so set on this and hadn't been driven by ideology, it's quite difficult to imagine how the war could have turned from 1940 onwards, because Germany is basically in control of all of Europe, with the exception of an island, that's Britain, but they're sitting on the island, they can't get off the island at that stage, and of course the Soviet Union, with which, as you've already said, Hitler, of course, has made a pact, and they're allies. So it would have been very, very difficult to change the strategic situation in Europe. But of course, then he follows his, well, let's call it the dream that he's always had, and he decides to go into the Soviet Union. But of course, that means that you have to start with the planning beforehand. And that is very, very important as well. You just don't start, you set in motion a massive army. And we look at the army and its composition later on. But this requires quite a bit of planning. And they really start, as you've already said, in the summer of 1940. So France is being defeated. So Hitler immediately looks to the east. Britain is still at war. Hitler offers peace to the British. They take nothing of that. And so he then decides to go east. And the first real plan that the Germans come up with is in the summer of 1940, and that's called Operations Draft East. That plan is put together by a German general, Erich Marx. So people who are interested, for example, in the Normandy campaign might have heard of him, because he is a corps commander that gets killed in the Normandy battle. And this is one of the very first drafts. So he is the man who puts the first plan together. Later on, Friedrich Paulus gets involved as well, and he basically puts the finishing touches to the whole plan. Friedrich Paulus, we talked about him in a previous episode, of course, the man linked to the Battle of Stalingrad. So very early on, they start with the planning, and there are different drafts, different ideas. Hitler finally receives the first time the plans on the 5th of December 1940. They make some changes, as already said. At that stage, it's still called Case Otto. He changes the name. And this then leads to the famous Führer Directive 21. And that is signed off on the 18th of December 1940. So basically half a year before the invasion really happens. And in this one, he really lays out the aims and the operational and strategic objectives that the Wehrmacht plus its allies, we mustn't forget allies were there as well, are to achieve when they invade the Soviet Union. So maybe we should look a little bit at the directive. Jesse, what does the directive tell us?
Well, what I find most interesting about the directive is the very first point when it comes to the purpose of this operation. It says, the very first point basically says, the mass of the Russian army in Western Russia is to be destroyed in daring operations by driving forward deep armored wedges, and the retreat of units capable of combat into the vastness of Russian territory is to be prevented. So that's kind of the first paragraph of what are we actually going to try to do here? And I think it's got a few different elements in it that if we kind of pick at them a little bit, we can see some of what the Germans are worried about and maybe what they're not putting emphasis on that's going to come back to bite them later. Some minor foreshadowing here, folks. So I feel like this idea of concentrating on destroying the fighting forces of the Red Army in Western Russia, yes, of course, you have to do that, but I feel like it's foreshadowing a little bit some of the blind spots of the Germans, right? If you're so focused just on crushing the enemy army in this one region, but what about if it has another army farther east, And obviously, you can see they want to imitate the success they had in France with driving forward these armored columns and so forth. The timeline is interesting. We're talking something like about 10, 12-ish weeks, if memory serves. This is the first time they're really planning for that kind of blitzkrieg. We talked in a previous episode at length about the idea of blitzkrieg. The Germans were not expecting the French to be defeated so quickly. Now they are expecting the Soviets to be defeated quite quickly. And you can see here they're already worried about the vastness of Russian territory. So they already know that could be a problem. And as we'll see, they don't adequately prepare for that problem, but it's there. That idea is there. By the way, just before I throw it back to you to kind of take us a little bit deeper into that, those were my sort of impressions. Some of the planning was done at bunkers south of Berlin, near the small town of Zossen, near an even smaller town called Wünsdorf, where you can still visit the ruins of these huge, the above ground sections. They do have some underground sections accessible as well, of this big complex, this big headquarters complex, where quite a bit of the planning was done. And then there was, interestingly enough, combat there again in April 1945. So that's a pretty cool place to visit if any of you listeners out there make it to the Berlin area.
It is a fascinating place. I'm sure you've been there many times. I've been there many times. So you need to book a guided tour and then they take you through it. And it is fascinating because you can actually see, as you've just said, Jesse, you can see the actual bunkers where Operation Barbarossa was planned. And you can imagine all these German staff officers running around like headless chickens trying to get things organized. You also have, by the way, the largest communications bunker in the world at Zossen during the Second World War, because from there the army conducted the war in the East, which was then used by the Soviets till the early 1990s as their communications bunker for the Soviet troops in Germany. So you can see how it all comes full circle. It's a fascinating place. It really is worth visiting. And you already talked about some of the problems and the issues that you find with this directive. One that I always find very, very interesting is that it doesn't really talk about what the end state is. So that's kind of left hanging. And the reason for that is that the Germans weren't quite sure either, because how far do you actually go? How far do you advance into the Soviet Union? Where do you stop fighting? When does it logistically become no longer possible to supply the armies in the East? And the first time people start thinking about this is in this Operations Draft East that I already mentioned from the summer of 1940. And Marx comes up with the idea of you might say it's an artificial line that they draw on the map. It's the so-called AA line. And the occupied area should stretch from Archangelsk in the north to Astrakhan in the south. And it's just because it's AA, it works quite well. So they take out the ruler and draw a line on the map, and that's it. And the idea was that behind that, you would still have some sort of a Russian empire, whatever you might want to call this. And they were expecting that the Russians would still be able to produce tanks and planes and other war equipment. So the idea that they have, and again, you can see how pure military thinking is linked here again to Nazi ideology. They thought that they would have a handful of divisions, perhaps 10, that would be fully equipped, that would be stationed along this AA border, and would then every now and then have an excursion, basically an offensive into the Eastern territories to weaken the Soviets again, plus the use of air force to bomb the factories. And you can see when Hitler talks about this, really interesting, because he sees this as the national school for the future army, the future German people. So the German youth should go there, harden itself in battle, and then be sent back to Germany. So it's really a bit of a half-baked idea, you might say. The moment, as you've already mentioned, the moment they leave behind the western areas of the Soviet Union, where, of course, the Soviets had stationed about half of the entire army as well, what happens then? And they're not entirely sure how to do this, what to do then. And that's one of the big problems. So the big problem of the German army in many respects up to 1941, and we'll look at this in a bit more detail later on, is actually it wins itself to death, but it doesn't have a strategic plan for the end of the war. So war is perpetual. It always goes on. There's always fighting. Again, that links quite nicely to Nazi ideology. But maybe that's not particularly clever when you look at geostrategic solutions and problems that need to be solved. So here's a massive and really, really big problem when you look at this. When you look at the directive, then again, in a bit more detail, you already mentioned probably the most important point. It also says, of course, we already talked about this, that the Wehrmacht needs to be able to crush, it says, Soviet Russia in a quick campaign, even before the conclusion of the war against England. It says England because the German terminology, everything on this island is England. Scotland doesn't exist. Northern Ireland doesn't exist. There we go. So that's the term that they use. So you can see there's a two-front war developing here. And that, of course, will have implications, obviously, later on as well. Hitler thinks that the UK is weakened to such a degree at this stage that he can afford to send the army to the east because he doesn't need the army in the west. And this also then shines through when you read the rest of the directive, where he talks about what the army is doing, the air force doing, and the navy is doing. And it's very clear what he says about the Navy. So the Navy doesn't even play second fiddle. It's probably third or fourth fiddle. The Navy isn't really important. A number of reasons for that, because, well, you're only looking at the Soviet Navy in the Baltic Sea. The Baltic Sea is more or less controlled by the Germans. Hitler and Germany on the whole, not maritime thinkers, not a maritime nation, so disregarding this aspect, forget about the Battle of the Atlantic, that's a different story, but in the East. So it's very much a land-focused war, which is also obvious in the structure of the German High Command, because the OKW, Oberkommando der Wehrmacht, Supreme Command of the Wehrmacht of the armed forces, is theoretically responsible for the conduct of the entire war everywhere, with the exception of one front, and that's the Eastern Front. And the Eastern Front is conducted by the OKH, which translates as Supreme Command of the Army. These people are sitting in Zossen to the south of Berlin. So already here you can see that the emphasis very, very clearly lies on the army, on the land forces. And Hitler and the Germans are able to move about 80% of their units, of the army units, from France and other bits of Europe, where they were stationed at that time, to the Eastern Front to then launch the attack. And the Air Force, in typical German military understanding of the Air Force, is mainly there to support the army. So the first task of the Air Force is to destroy the Soviet Air Force, which they then do quite successfully. Again, we'll return to that later on. And it's then there to support, in close air support, the army as it moves forward. And it's only after the war has been won, so these about 8 to 10 weeks in the East, that the role of the Air Force would then shift to strategic bombing of these factories further to the East. But apart from that, very much and very clearly a land-focused campaign.
Let me, in a moment, forgive me, listeners, but we want to get into the story as well of what happens in this epic and tragic campaign and how it turns out the way it does. So I'm gonna again speed us up, and I'll give the Coles Notes version of the German operational plan. Then, Matthias, you can fill in the key points that I've left out. And then we'll have a look at the Soviets, because we haven't much gotten to them so far. And it's quite an interesting side of the story, what's going on the Soviet side of things. So the plan that ends up being implemented by the Germans. Now, there were some hemming and hawing, and there were a few adjustments, as you mentioned, the title, but also there were some suggestions from some generals that Moscow should be a primary goal, whereas then Hitler tended to gravitate towards, no, maybe we want more the industrial areas, the resource areas for oil, for food production, and so on and so forth. So already you see a few differences of opinion that are going to come back to haunt the Germans as well. But essentially, when things kick off in June, you have over 3.5 million German and other Axis troops, I suppose primarily Romanian in the initial stages, and they're going to hit the Soviet Union on a front that's absolutely gargantuan, something like 2,000 kilometers if you take in all the little curves and borders and so on. They've got 148 divisions to do this. They have 17 of those divisions are Panzer, so armored divisions, which have about 3,400, 3,500 tanks, and they're supported by something like 2,700 Luftwaffe aircraft. This massive army, and then there are the Romanians, of course, in the southern corner as well, who are going to advance into what is today southern Ukraine towards Odessa. These forces are broadly divided into 3 army groups. Army Group North is going to go through the Baltics, which of course are part of the Soviet Union at the time, going to go through the Baltics towards Leningrad, today St. Petersburg again. Army Group Center is the strongest one. It's going to be headed towards Central European Russia in the direction of Moscow. And then Army Group South. And these two are divided by a big marshy area called the Pripyat Marshes, which is kind of difficult to get through. Army Group South is basically going to head through Ukraine and is going to end up in eastern Ukraine, in the infamous, today anyway, for us reading the news, Donbass region, more or less, and towards Rostov and that bend in the big Don River. So more or less, you have a three-pronged attack with the largest invading force ever assembled. What did I miss?
I think you basically summed it up nicely. But of course, well, I need to say something because otherwise, why would I be here? So absolutely right. Everything you said from the German point of view. There is a big debate in the German High Command. Is it all about the industrial outputs? Is it about the agricultural land in the Ukraine? And you already mentioned the Donbass, which of course we hear a lot about today. Or is it St. Petersburg and Moscow? And the lesson from the First World War and also from the Russian Civil War, or the understanding in those days, was that he who holds St. Petersburg and Moscow pretty much controls the rest of the country, which is probably still the case today. When you go to Russia and only about 100 kilometers outside of Moscow, you feel like you're in a different country and particularly also in a different century. So that's quite interesting. Three army groups, you mentioned it, and the Northern Army Group North under a field marshal who's called Leeb. It's interesting because he's actually an expert on the defense. He wrote a big book about that in the interwar period. It's also the weakest one. So it only has 7 infantry divisions plus 3 tank divisions, which by modern standards, 21st century standards, sounds like a lot. Every Western European army would be happy to have that. But by 1941 standards, it's a bit different. Yes, their idea is to go to Leningrad. Seize it or not, it doesn't really matter to Hitler. In many ways, he would prefer not to be seized, really, isolate it and encircle it. Because otherwise you end up with about 1 million extra hungry mouths to feed. And that's a different story, but the siege of Leningrad up to 1944 is also fascinating. When you look at the operational plan, so that was really the first goal, get towards Leningrad. You then have Army Group Center, you already mentioned it. This is the strong one, 42 divisions. And where it's really strong is the 9 tank divisions that they've got. The idea to really drive towards Moscow. And then you've got Army Group South, which is also very interesting because when you look at the number of divisions, it's actually the strongest army group within the Wehrmacht in the East. It's got 52 divisions. So that's quite a lot. However, when you scratch the surface a little bit and dig it a bit deeper, you can see that of these 52, you've got 15 Romanian divisions. You also have 2 Hungarian and 2 Italian divisions. And then they've got German tank divisions, but that's 5, so less than an army group center. So you can already see, just by the composition of this army group, that the point of main effort for the Germans was not necessarily in this area, because you have all these other divisions from other countries, and the combat value that the Germans attached to these was relatively low. So they're not expecting the decision to happen in this area. And what really, really makes it difficult for everyone who decides to invade the Soviet Union, which, as history tells us, is a very stupid idea, is the Pripyat Marshes. You already mentioned the Pripyat Marshes, a huge marshy area, basically to the east of Brest-Litovsk, roughly speaking. If you ever want to look at a map, that's where it is, and it is huge. You can't just move troops from north to south. You would always have to get them back, probably into modern-day Poland, to then move them out again. So logistically, that is very, very complex and very difficult. So that is the German side and the German ideas. But as you said, we've now talked for about 34 minutes, and we haven't even mentioned the Soviets there yet. So let's have a look at what the Soviets are doing, what the Soviets are planning, and what the Soviets perhaps also knew about the German war plans.
There's a great deal of discussion that's been had about what the Soviets knew, didn't know, what the Germans knew and didn't know about the Soviets. Right, so German intelligence has come under a lot of criticism because they vastly underestimated the strength of the Red Army, the strength of the Soviet state, the resilience of their institutions, the number of tanks they had, the types of tanks that they had, the newer models like the T-34 and the KV-1, for example, which provided a lot of difficulties for the Germans. The Soviet Union has been going through a very tumultuous period. And that's probably true of most periods in the Soviet Union's history until it stagnated for quite some time, but that was long after World War II. So Stalin has, in the late 1920s and early 1930s, done a couple of things that have an impact on how the Soviets are able to react to Barbarossa. For one, he collectivized agriculture at great cost in human lives, but also in economic productivity. So you have a country that is less productive with the collectivized agriculture and lost 3 to 6 million dead, mostly in the Ukrainian Soviet Socialist Republic, but also in some parts of Russia. He also then led these wild political purges and military purges in the late 1930s, where not only were, say, for example, ethnic Poles targeted and deported to the east and killed, but a huge proportion of the generalship and the officer corps of the Red Army was also eliminated, including very influential, very talented thinkers. For example, Tukhachevsky, right? He's killed in the purges in the late 1930s. So this weakens the Red Army dramatically. It does learn something from its experience in the Winter War against Finland, but it also doesn't perform that great. And there's an incentive within that institution to please the higher ups rather than actually reforming and actually improving. And this weakens the Red Army gravely. In addition, they have intelligence on what's coming, but they don't believe it and they don't act on it. And this intelligence comes from several sources. The British do learn something about Operation Barbarossa coming through Ultra, through the fact that they're able to read many of the German codes, thanks partially to the Poles, who played an important role in the Ultra story. Shouldn't leave that out. They warn the Soviets, and the Soviets think, this is another British plot. They're the world's greatest imperialists and so on. The US also warns them. They also ignore that. There's a famous spy, a German named Richard Sorge, who's in Japan, ostensibly as a journalist. He fought for Germany in the First World War, but then was disillusioned, became a communist, and he gave intelligence as well internally that this was coming. And Stalin decided that no, I'm not going to act on this intelligence. I'm not going to consider this intelligence to be credible. And that contributed enormously to the initial difficulties that the Soviets face when the invasion goes in, despite the fact that the Red Army has 5 million men in uniform, which is absolutely massive, and it has more than 20,000 tanks, which is also incredibly massive. And the Germans have no inkling that there are this many tanks. Now, how they use them and what quality most of them are is another question, but they certainly have mass on their side. So that, to me, those are some of the critical elements that we should think about when considering the Stalin side. I was going to say, now that's reductive, the Soviet side in the lead up to Barbarossa. I don't know if you've got any other threads you want to weave into the story as well.
I think these were the main ones and the most important ones. It seems a little bit like Stalin is staring at the situation like the rabbit that's staring at the snake, because he's getting all this information, but he doesn't want to believe it. And there are accounts from the German side when the Germans then finally attack in the morning of the 22nd of June 1941, as they rush into, let's face it, at that stage, it's still occupied Poland, which the Soviets had occupied in 1939. They're advancing past these trains that bring raw materials from the Soviet Union to Germany as part of the Hitler-Stalin pact. So that is quite interesting. And of course, Stalin then has a nervous breakdown. He goes to his dacha and disappears for a while. And no one knows really where he is. He can't be disturbed, which then in the early stages of the campaign also, of course, causes problems for the Soviets. Returning to your point about the purges, it's a big one that people mention. Of course it is. When you just look at the numbers, it's absolutely shocking. So the Soviets remove, as they would call it, which in most cases, not all of them, but in most cases, of course, means you find yourself with a bullet in your head. They remove 3 out of 5 marshals. 13 or 15 army commanders, 8 of 9 admirals, 50 or 57 army commanders, and 154 of 186 divisional commanders. That really is a purge. That's a blood loss. And yes, then they go into Finland. As you already said, the campaign does not go particularly well. They don't impress anybody, which again sends a message to the Germans. So if you want to go into the Soviet Union, as Hitler said, all you need to do is you just need to kick in the front door and the entire rotten structure will come tumbling down. Everybody in the world believed that. When you look at the reports from the defense attaches in Moscow, the Western ones, they expected the Germans to win this war in 6 to 8 weeks' time. And they were burning their papers and packing their material about 1 or 2 weeks into the campaign. So it's difficult for the Soviets. You mentioned the numbers. They're absolutely big. They're huge. There is a famous videotape. It's still slightly debated whether it's original or not, where Hitler meets up with Mannerheim, the Finnish general, the later stage of the war. And it's fascinating. If it's really real, probably it is. Lots of work has been done on it. And I think the consensus that it is, because the first thing I find fascinating is that this tape, so Hitler has a meeting with Mannerheim in a railway carriage, and that's recorded secretly. And the tape survived. And the first thing I find fascinating about it is the voice in which he speaks. Because he has a very, very soft, Jesse, you know that, very soft Austrian accent, nothing of this shouting, screaming maniac that you constantly see in the footage that we see. That's for the press. His real language, his real accent was very, very softly spoken, very, very, very Austrian. No Prussian at all in him, not even in the language. And the other thing that is fascinating, that's why I mentioned it, he talks about the tanks. And he said, well, I didn't know they had 20,000 tanks. If I'd known they had 20,000 tanks, I might not even have attacked. So they sure got massed. There's a lot. You mentioned the numbers, about 5 million people. The way they used them is difficult. In accordance with Soviet doctrine, they've been deployed relatively closely to a potential front line. The only front line they have in the West would be one with Germany, which then gave rise to this idea that the German attack was a preemptive strike. We talked about that in a different episode. It wasn't, but that's the argument that's being used, which then makes it comparatively easy for the Germans to follow their plan, go back to the directive, destroy the Soviet forces in the western part of the Soviet Union. And when you look at the dislocation of the Soviet troops, so where are these troops? It basically, you might say to a degree, mirrors what the Germans are doing. So they realize or regard the central part of a potential front line as the most important one, the most vulnerable one, where the Germans would be able to achieve the most important strategic objective, and that, of course, is seizing Moscow. So when you look at the forces of what they call the Western Front, they are particularly strong because also the sector is quite small. To the north of that, you then have the Northwestern Front. That, to give you some ideas, is 28 infantry divisions plus 3 mechanized corps. Soviet formations tend to be slightly smaller than Western ones, so you always have to take all of this with a bit of a pinch of salt. The Western Front in the center, I already mentioned, 49 infantry divisions and 2 mechanized corps. And then the entire southern part, similar to what the Germans are doing with Army Group South, is covered by the Southwest Front. Again, it's the strongest one, 64 infantry divisions plus 5 mechanized corps. But the front line there is really, 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 really big. So when you look at the map, Army Group South on the German side and the Southwest Front of the Soviet side, that covers about 50% of the front line. So just looking at the fronts and the figures doesn't really do it justice. But they're kind of planning a similar war, or at least have identified the same objectives as the Germans. What are the key points? What are the bits that you, if you're German, need to seize? And if you're a Soviet commander or Stalin, you need to protect in order to be able to continue the war. So not all that dissimilar. And yet, when the Soviets then finally get hit by the German attack on the 22nd of June, of course, what happens does not really follow the Soviet rulebook. So maybe it's time to have a look at the 22nd of June and see what's happening there when the Germans finally do attack. What do you think?
I'll do you one better, and I will go on another Cole's Notes top speed summary of the first, let's say, month or 6 weeks, and then we can kind of rehash and pick our spots to go into a little more detail to explain what's going on and why. So, June 22nd, Operation Barbarossa begins. Panic on much of the Soviet line because they're not prepared for this. You have commanders trying to radio back when their lines were not cut, basically saying, "We're being shot at. What do I do? Do I shoot back?" There's complete chaos. And what happens from that day onwards is essentially, well, first of all, on that day as well, I think you mentioned this earlier, but the Luftwaffe basically destroys much of the Red Air Force on the ground. So almost 2,000 Soviet aircraft are destroyed on the ground. Plus they hit the airfields, plus they hit artillery concentrations, plus they hit troop buildup, plus they hit rail and communication centers, all to try to paralyze the Red Army, which they are fairly successful, the Germans, at doing that at the beginning. To give you an idea of how this works in the first few weeks, you listeners, of course, Matthias, I suppose this is familiar ground for you.
I hope so.
Army Group North, which is heading towards Leningrad, they advance 800 kilometers in 3 weeks. It's unbelievable. Army Group Center, they are the biggest one, of course, or the strongest one, let's say. They're smashing through what is today Eastern Poland and Belarus primarily. By the 27th of July, so one month and a few days, they've managed to successfully carry out 2 huge encirclements, one around the town of Minsk, which is in Belarus, and one around the town of Smolensk, which is in Western Russia. This terrain is very flat, just north of the Pripyat marshes, mostly. So it's great for maneuver warfare. It's great for this German idea of we're going to send these armored columns deep behind the enemy and surround them. And they've surrounded these 2 huge groups of Soviet troops. They've taken, and if you haven't heard about this before, have a seat, people at home. Army Group Center, by July 27th, takes 620,000 prisoners of war. 620,000. No Western country, well, possibly except the US, I'm not sure of those stats. No European country at the moment, west of Ukraine, has 600,000 people really in uniform in the army. And they are gone in 1 month, only on the central part of the front. On the southern front, the Germans, that is, are able to make good progress deep into what is now Ukraine. What happens is that the Germans run into a few interesting problems. The tanks move faster than the infantry. So you've always got this game of catch up where you need to have the infantry mop up resistance, take the prisoners and so forth, and the tanks are somewhere up ahead. But this risk pays off. The Soviets try to counterattack as their doctrine would tell them to do. Yes, we need to counterattack, push the enemy back, but they're completely disorganized. Their command and control doesn't work very well. Their tank crews, for example, are not well trained. They don't have the right ammunition where it has to be, and so on and so forth. So the Germans are able to get away with a lot of these risks of sending the tanks so far out ahead. But even then, of course, the Germans run into some logistical problems as well. They haven't planned well enough for the logistics, and so there are shortages holding back the tanks, or they could have gone even farther. This is basically the situation until, let's say, like beginning of August, more or less. This is kind of what's happening. Matthias, take us now in depth. Where do we have to go beneath the surface here to understand what's going on?
There's so many factors. Again, we probably need 5 to 10 podcasts to do it all justice. But maybe just picking 1 or 2 of the points that you mentioned. Logistics, absolutely essential. I think I've said this before in a different podcast. It's relatively boring stuff. Logisticians out there, forgive me. And the German army is very, very poor on logistics. When you go to the east, everything is worse because you don't have good infrastructure. The railways that everything and everyone relies on in the Soviet Union, of course, have different gauges, so they need to be changed to put them, make them smaller so the German trains can run on them. And you've got all sorts of underlying issues and problems just because the country is so vast. So that is a particular set of challenges to the Germans. And yes, when you look at the map and you look at what is happening, it looks as if the Germans are just slicing through. And they're just advancing and advancing and advancing. Well, the interesting thing is once you start taking that apart a little bit, you can see that the Germans are beginning to run into, well, perhaps you might call that problems relatively early on. And that is that the Soviets actually stand and fight, which really confuses a lot of the Germans because in France, They had seen that once the enemy is surrounded and they realize they are not winning and they have to surrender, they do surrender. In the Soviet Union, they don't do that for a number of reasons. The first one is perhaps that they're afraid of their own commissars. The next one is, you mentioned these pockets. These pockets are so vast, you don't even know what's going on. You've got 600,000 people in the pocket, 665,000 in the pocket of Kiev alone. This is huge. So that does not mean that everyone knows what's going on in the pocket all the time. And you can take that back perhaps to the very first day, the 22nd of June. There is a famous incident, and that is the siege of the town, the city of Brest and Brest Fortress, which stands right on the border between German-occupied Poland and Soviet-occupied Poland. And according to the German plan, that should have fallen within a day. And they use an entire division, about 17,000 men, to attack this. You've got 9,000 Soviet soldiers in there. And the fighting, which should have been over, according to German plans, within a day, takes about a week. Not a lot of German air support. It's all infantry fighting, and it is quite bloody. So the Germans lose about 430 killed and 670, roughly speaking, wounded. On the Soviet side, 2,000 dead, and the rest go into captivity. But it's really interesting and fascinating when you look at some of the accounts that you can see from this particular fighting on the very first day, where everyone thinks Germany's just slicing through. So, for example, if I read one or two of them out from this particular engagement, so these are German ones. The 81st Combat Engineer Battalion was given the task of blowing up a building on the central island in order to put an end to the Russian, they mean Soviet, flanking fire on the North Island. Explosives were lowered from the roof of the building towards the windows, then the fuses were lit. When they exploded, we could hear the Soviet soldiers screaming and groaning, but they continued to fight. There are lots of other ones. I don't want to read them all out because that would take hours, but you get the idea. So they just keep fighting. And that, of course, means that even at this stage, when the Germans are seemingly winning and they're occupying all these areas and all the territory, they are losing manpower as well. And they are losing manpower on a very, very high scale. So when you go to the Battle of Kiev, for example, after it's over, I'm jumping forward a little bit to September, because that's my statistic works like that, to the 30th of September, the Germans have lost about 500,000 men in the east. So they go into it with about just over 3 million Germans, plus the other ones. You're looking at around about 3.8 million. They've lost about 500,000 of these. And the problem is they've got nothing coming forward, because Hitler and everyone else is convinced that this war will be won very, very quickly. So they're actually reducing the output of tanks. They want to produce more planes and more submarines to continue the fight against the UK once Russia has been, or the Soviet Union has been defeated. And it's the same with reinforcements and manpower coming forward. There's not a lot. So the German army is getting weaker and weaker already at the stage. And that will get even worse when we get to the last stage, that is Operation Typhoon, the drive towards Moscow, which we'll get to in a few minutes.
I'm glad you brought up the story of Brest, the fortress at Brest, because it's become legendary in the Soviet and now Russian historical memory, collective memory, popular history memory of the war. There's, I forget when it was made, I think 2015, I want to say, but there's a famous movie made in Russia about the fortress of Brest-Litovsk. And of course, one of the little parts of that story is that there's graffiti that's found in the fortress after it has eventually been neutralized and the defenders nearly all killed. And I'm paraphrasing from memory here because I didn't take this down as a note before the podcast, which I probably should have. But the graffiti goes something like, "We are dying, but we are not surrendering." And that's a powerful message, because in the midst of a catastrophic defeat, the Soviets don't give up. I mean, of course, hundreds and hundreds of thousands do surrender, but oftentimes after fighting, and the ones who don't surrender fight like mad. So this is really something that slows down the Germans, of course, as you mentioned, not only at a place like Brest, but say, for example, at a place like Odessa, where there's very bitter fighting for a long time, and even more, now I'm also skipping ahead a bit to the fall, at a place like Sevastopol on Crimea, where there's incredibly hard fighting in the underground caverns and tunnels and sewers for many months. And it holds up the Germans and Romanians for quite some time, because they have to besiege Sevastopol when they can't capture it. I wanted to mention as well something that came to me. I talked a lot about Stalin's mistakes leading up to the campaign, but one of the reasons why the Soviets are able to take these huge material losses of tanks, especially, but also of artillery, is the unbelievably harsh, but also fairly successful industrialization program that Stalin forced on the Soviet Union in the 1930s with these famous 5-year plans, which were very geared towards heavy industry and military production. A lot of that was lost or wasted in the first couple of months of the campaign, but that heavy industrial base is there. It exists. It can be repurposed now to turn out T-34s instead of the much weaker and outdated T-26s, for example. So I have to give Stalin a bit of credit here for creating this, for contributing to the creation of this heavy industrial resource. And of course, again, through harsh methods, the Soviets are able, while all this is going on, to transport many of these factories further east. Now, some of them are lost. Some of the transport does not go as planned. And you have bits of one factory end up here and bits of another factory of that factory end up also 1,000 kilometers further east in Siberia. So it's not perfect, but it does help preserve some of the Soviet industrial capability that was built in the 1930s under Stalin. However, to get us back on track here a little bit, the reason why I stopped at sort of, let's say, early-ish August is because the Germans then run into a decision that they have to make. And this is something I want to get your thoughts on, Matthias. The Germans basically say, okay, we're taking losses, our logistics are under stress, our tanks are outrunning the logistics, the infantry needs time to consolidate. What are we going to do? And here comes this old split in German thinking. Do we go towards Moscow or do we go towards the heavy industry near Leningrad and especially the heavy industry of Donbass and the fertile lands of Ukraine and then potentially the oil of the Caucasus region, today's Azerbaijan primarily? Which one do we prioritize? Because it's already clear that we're probably not going to be able to make all three without stopping. So they essentially stop Army Group Center. And after much discussion, they decide to divert a lot of their so-called elite units, a lot of the armored units south into Ukraine. And this is where Kyiv comes into play, as you mentioned. And there's another huge envelopment of 650,000 plus Red Army soldiers around Kyiv. So they're kind of having to make compromises, the Germans are. But on paper, they are decimating the Red Army, especially the Red Army that is stationed in the battlefront area.
Absolutely right. And as you said, this big debate, should we continue the drive towards Moscow or divert the troops from Army Group Center to go south? That is a fascinating debate because it also shows the difference in understanding of what it means to run and conduct and also plan a major war. So I personally would say that Hitler was probably right in his decision because he is the man who says, no, I want these troops from Army Group Center to be diverted towards the south. Yes, we can take out the Soviet troops there. But even more important to him was the fact that he would then get his hands on the Donbass, on the industrial area, on the fertile lands. Go back to his whole idea about ideology. Why does he want to go in there in the first place? It's all about the fertile lands, the living space. So that's really important. The military people saying, no, it's all about Moscow, as agreed before. And you can see when you take this back and you go really in detail through the planning stages, this had never been resolved. You always had these two camps here. But I would personally say Hitler's actually more of a geostrategic thinker here than the German generals. So that's quite interesting. And yes, they do get a lot of the Soviet troops in the bag at Kiev, 665,000. People have argued the biggest pocket in the history of warfare. Again, the problem is this takes time. It takes a lot of time to clear these pockets, to send the troops, and that also means casualties. And the main problem is the time. The Germans have only given them up to about 10 weeks to reach Moscow, to seize or at least encircle Leningrad, to basically win the war. And what they're doing now is, of course, diverting all these troops from the point of main effort. And that means that they will have to regroup them. They will have to get the logistics forward. And only then can you start the offensive again. So if they perhaps, for argument's sake, stop now, when I said, you know what, that was a relatively successful campaign, even though the Soviets haven't surrendered and the state hasn't collapsed. But of course, that is not the idea. Hitler's idea is to bring this war to a successful conclusion as quickly as possible. And this is the reason why they then regroup again, bring these troops back up north. And now we go to the last and final episode of Operation Barbarossa, and that is the so-called Operation Typhoon, which is the German drive towards Moscow, really trying to bring the war to an end before the winter really sets in. And of course, the big problem is when you look at weather in that and climate in the Soviet Union, is you're now entering the time where you get lots of rain, we get lots of mud, the Rasputitsa as it's called, which basically makes it impossible for particular vehicles to move, which brings operations to a standstill. We can still see this being played out today. When you look at what goes on in the Ukraine, these things have to be taken into consideration. And when the Germans then start looking at this attack against and towards Moscow again, they can only really start having their tanks rolling in the late autumn. So before that, everyone just sits idle and still because you can't move forward. And that, of course, is a problem because it makes it possible for the Soviets to strengthen the defenses around Moscow. So talk us through a little bit about what happens when they get to the gates of Moscow.
Right. I'll give another whistle-stop tour of this phase of the campaign, and then we'll pick it apart as we've been doing so far. So obviously the Red Army has suffered cataclysmic losses unlike any other army has suffered in history, essentially. And yet they're still there. They're still fighting because they have this massive built-up, let's say, more or less trained pool of manpower from the kind of draconian Soviet pre-war conscription policies. They call people up. They shift troops from their large standing army from the east to the west. They get information that Japan is not going to attack them as well in September from this agent in Japan, Richard Sorge, so they can be sure that they don't have to keep too many troops in the Far East. And so that frees up some troops, which they shift. They mobilize citizens, and of course they mobilize them without choice. They mobilize citizens in the Moscow area, for example, to dig anti-tank ditches and so on and so forth. So they're really trying to throw together this last defense. They are short of complex heavy weapon systems at this stage, right? So they're even more than they were before. They're an infantry and artillery army in the fall of 1941. But on the defensive, in a context like the Second World War, you can do a lot with an infantry and artillery-based army, especially when there's mud and then after there's cold. So the Germans, essentially, Army Group Center tries to start the advance on Operation Typhoon in October. But it's so muddy that they can only really make a proper push, let's say, once it gets a little bit colder into November. And then they make another push. They get very close, actually. Some of the most advanced German scouting units can see the Kremlin in the distance from just several tens of kilometers away. But, the Germans are slowly but surely getting weaker. The Soviets, although they're not as strong as they were at the very start, they're certainly stronger in October and November, much stronger than they were in August and September, for example. So they managed to hold out, the Soviets do, by a Herculean effort until they're in a position to launch their own counteroffensive that starts on December 5th. And they're able to throw the Germans back something like 200 kilometers or 150 kilometers from those front lines very close to Moscow and essentially stabilize, from the Soviet point of view, pretty destabilizing from the German point of view, though, stabilize that central part of the Eastern Front. That is a very, very quick summary of Operation Typhoon and then the Soviet response. So again, take us into your favorite deep, dark woods.
The deep dark woods
here. Let's go for
Back
it.
to the deep dark woods and Hansel and Gretel, absolutely. So Operation Typhoon, when you look at it and when you look at the German plans, it basically was doomed from the start. The troop numbers are simply not there anymore. The Germans have a handful of divisions that they can use for this particular offensive. And when you look at the sheer numbers that they've got, they're so small that even if they got into Moscow and had to fight their way through, the question is, how would they have controlled such a big city? Moscow is the largest city in Europe at that particular time. I think it still is today. It's completely illusionary. The one who fares particularly badly is Guderian, the famous Panzer general. He makes a number of bad decisions, and the messages he sends back to high command are not necessarily all true. So it's really a complete disaster. You already mentioned it. The recce elements get to a place which is called Khimki, which is now the outskirts of Moscow. That's 8 kilometers from the Kremlin. There's a huge big monument there these days. You can't really get there because it's surrounded by roads. There's a huge big IKEA next to it, which in some ways is a bit ironic. But that's how far they get. And they could actually see, as you said, the spires of the Kremlin. And then the counterattack sets in, and they're driven back. So when you look at the plans and the way the operation was conducted, completely illusionary that the Germans would achieve anything with it. And you might say it's probably this mission creep. One more push, one more push, one more push, and we would have done it. They should have stopped and consolidate and then prepare for another year. They don't. Then they're hit by the counteroffensive you already mentioned, which brings the army in the east very, very close to collapse. And again, you have these different debates and ideas in the German high command. The one school of thought saying, well, we should abandon the positions and withdraw. To which, in particular, Hitler says, no, we can't do that. We have to stand and fight. Because if we run away now, we'll have to leave behind all the equipment and we'll be run down by Soviet tanks in the open terrain where you've got lots of snow. So he orders them to stand and fight. The blood loss of the Germans in this particular phase is absolutely awful. And when the campaign is over, that part of the campaign, they issue a campaign medal which says Winterschlacht im Osten, so the winter battle in the East, 1941, which looks a little bit like an Iron Cross second class. And that became known in German as the Gefrierfleischorden, which translates as the Medal of the Frozen Flesh, because that's what it is. Because people there didn't have any winter equipment. The idea being, go back to the original idea, you defeat the Soviet Union in about 10 weeks. All these units would then be brought back into Germany to prepare for a war against the UK in whatever shape or form, and you'd only have about 10 divisions or so that would have been stationed there. So about 10 divisions of the army, plus most of the Waffen-SS divisions, because they were supposed to stay in the east as well, had proper winter clothing. All the other ones stay there in their positions, temperatures of -20, -30 degrees in their summer coats. And you can imagine what the consequences of that are. And when you just look at the sheer casualties that the Germans are suffering, and also looking at the reinforcements that they get. I already mentioned that's one of the big problems. They haven't got anything coming forward. So in December, for example, 1941, when the Soviets launched the counterattack, the Germans lose close to 170,000 men on that front alone. They only get 80,000 replacements. And the worst month is January 1942, where they lose about 215,000 men. Just again, think about these dimensions. But they only get about 44,000 men as replacements. So you can see how the army is getting weaker and weaker and weaker, while seemingly the Soviet army is getting stronger and stronger. Not only is it getting stronger numerically, but they're now more in the element, you might say. General Winter, as it was called in those days, works in the favor of the Soviets because they've got the winter equipment, because they've got numerical reinforcements. You mentioned Sorge, so they're bringing lots of troops from the east as well. And of course, just the general equipment. German machine guns would just freeze. They couldn't fire. German tanks wouldn't work. Whereas the Soviet equipment was designed for a war like this. The German equipment wasn't. And that causes lots of problems on the German side, as we can imagine.
Yes, and we're going to get into a more thorough discussion with the time that we have left of why the whole operation failed in a moment. What I'd like to do before then, now that we've gone through the genesis of it, we've gone through the course of Barbarossa, I wanted to throw in a little kind of factoid I thought is significant, maybe in a bit of foreshadowing, is that one of the results of the failure of Barbarossa, because of course, the mission, if we go back to the directive, right, directive number 21, the mission is to destroy the Red Army. And they have not achieved that. The Red Army is still there. It's still fighting. It's even able to bring the German army to the brink of collapse, as you mentioned. And of course, the Soviet state, it's been rocked, but it's still there. It's still functioning as a polity that's able to have agency, that's able to make decisions, and so on and so forth, that's able to try to impose its will on the battlefield, if we're going to get into a little bit of that type of theory. So all those things.
Very Clausewitzian here. There we go.
I knew you'd
now we're going very
it.
deep and dark.
Yes, deep, dark Clausewitz. Here we go. So given that, it means that by the Germans' own definition as well, that Barbarossa is a failure, right? And one of the consequences of that, there are many German generals who get sacked, including Guderian for the time being. And Hitler sacks the commander-in-chief, von Brauchitsch, and makes himself commander-in-chief. Reminiscent for me, a kind of World War I guy, reminiscent of Nicholas II, who makes himself a commander-in-chief after the great Russian defeat of 1915. So that's a very, very risky move. It also politicizes the military situation even further, more than it already was. And on the topic of politicized warfare, it wouldn't be right, I think, to talk about Barbarossa during a whole episode of this podcast without talking about the atrocities and the crimes against humanity and the war crimes and so on. And there's no shortage, unfortunately. And I want to point out a few examples, although we could do many podcasts on the war crimes in the East by both sides, particularly the Germans, of course. But I once was visiting the Ukrainian town of Uman. It's in central Ukraine. It's a nice little regional town. It's got some interesting things there. And one of the things I happened upon that I didn't expect were two nondescript buildings. And you can tell there's some of the rare-ish buildings in the former western part of the Soviet Union that predate World War II. You could tell that from the style. And in the basement of one of those buildings, they're both on the same street. They were like a block away. We were walking, my partner and I. It took us maybe 2-3 minutes between these two buildings. In one of the buildings, before the Soviets retreated, the NKVD, so the secret police, the security forces, they just figured, well, we have all these political prisoners in the jail in this town. We can't take them with us because it's total panic and we got to save our own skins. So in the basement of one of those buildings, they killed them all, hundreds and hundreds of them, executed them all. Not a couple hundred meters away from that is another building where the Germans, when they arrived in town, rounded up, I believe, 2,000 Jews. It's a fairly large building, shoved them into the basement and set the thing on fire and killed those Jews in the basement. And this is right next to them. So you have, this made me think of Timothy Snyder's famous book, Bloodlands, right? Where you have an overlap of Soviet criminal regime and a Nazi criminal regime, and the kind of doubling up and the feeding off of the dynamic, feeding off of each other in terms of atrocities is absolutely wild. And this is repeated, of course, ad nauseum in these newly occupied territories. But, of course, that's not the biggest scale of crime either. You have the killing of the Jews that begins already during Barbarossa, where you have Einsatzgruppen, for example, who go behind the lines, and mass shootings of Jews. This is before, the gas chambers become the main system for killing Jews, and they're transported back to these death camps. This is before that becomes the main mechanism of the Holocaust. You have mass shootings in every village, in every town. They stretch well into 1942, but they already start in 1941. One of the most famous and biggest mass killings, mass shootings is in Kiev at a place called Babin Yar. You can visit it today. There's a big Soviet-era memorial there. It was a ravine. Nearly 40,000 Jews were shot there over the course of a couple of days. And this repeats itself in every town and village. And of course, there are some collaborators in different parts of the Soviet Union who assist the Germans with this. Not only Baltic peoples, but some Ukrainians as well, some Russians also, some of everyone. But the Germans also recruit, in some cases, children. And this is one of the most kind of disturbing parts of the Holocaust, if I can put it that way, that I've come across and had the chance to read about, is that they had some Ukrainian children help kind of tamp down the bodies in the pits after they shot them by walking over them. And there was a French priest in the 1990s and early 2000s who did dozens and dozens and hundreds of interviews with those Ukrainian children who'd been forced to participate in that. And it makes for absolutely harrowing reading of what they what they were forced to do and experience. I have a quote, but actually, now that I'm talking about this, I think I'll spare us. I think we get the idea of how horrific this was. And the final type of crime that I think really marks Barbarossa is the killing of Soviet prisoners of war by the Germans, right? This is not an accident. This is not a lack of planning for enough food. If your idea and your objective is to destroy nearly the entirety of the Red Army, you have to expect that you're going to have hundreds of thousands, if not a couple million prisoners of war, which of course the Germans then do have. And they let them die of exposure. They let them die of thirst, of hunger. They kill them wantonly. This is the system, right? They put a big circle of barbed wire in an open field, and then whatever happens, happens, essentially. And I have a collection of published letters from Soviet POWs who managed to survive, which are the minority from those captured in 1941, managed to survive the war. And one of them was Georgy Grizenko. He was captured in that huge pocket around Kiev in September, one of the 665,000. And he described one scene. We'll just use that as a representative case for today, because we've got to keep this within reasonable limits for you listeners out there. So Mr. Grizenko was captured, and this is one incident that he was a part of. In Kiev, they drove us onto the site of an evacuated factory. There was a water pump there. The crush of people to get to the pump was so great that fistfights broke out. Everyone wanted to quench his thirst. To restore order, the Germans tried to shoot into the crowd to break it up. After a while, they trained a machine gun on the pump, which did not remain without victims. I too risked my life for a mouthful of water, but thank God, I survived. So just one tiny incident in an entire sea of these kinds of crimes that are occurring behind the lines of all of these interesting historical military maneuvers and so on that we've been discussing now for most of this podcast. So I don't know if you want to add anything to that, Matthias, but that was my little bracket of, we need to remember that side of, what we're essentially focusing on as a military operation for today anyway.
It is an absolutely important point to remember because, as you mentioned, the war in the East is so horrific and awful, and so many acts of barbarism committed that you have to talk about it. You're absolutely right. When you look at the numbers, the casualties, whether they're military, civilian, you can break this down as you have done. You can include the Jews in there. So it's warfare. If you want to call this warfare, maybe it's just slaughter on a completely different scale. And you have to admit that, this was planned, as you've said already, it was planned that way by the Germans. Go back to the very, very beginning of what we talked about. You want to have this Lebensraum, the living space. The last thing you want to have there is hungry mouths that you need to feed when you don't want them there. And that goes back to, for example, the so-called hunger plan, which was formulated on the 2nd of May, 1941. And the idea being that they wanted to create an artificial famine in that part of the world. And that's the Germans, thought that would kill between 30 and 45 million people. So that's really, really awful. You mentioned the Soviet prisoners, 5 million are also captured by the Germans. A year later, 3.3 million of them are dead. Mostly died because of starvation. And also at the pure military level, when you link these two and you look at atrocities and war crimes, you've got the same thing. Of course, both sides committed them, but it's very, very clear and obvious that on the German side, this was wanted. And there are a number of orders. I probably don't have time to go through all of them in great detail, but maybe mentioning one or two. So the first one from the 13th of May, 1941, so before the invasion has even happened, is the so-called Kriegsgerichtsbarkeitserlass, a very good German word. Yes, it is one word, not two, not three, it's just one. In English, it's called the Barbarossa Decree, much easier. And that basically sends out the message and says, whatever you do, when you're there as a soldier, and whatever atrocity, whatever war crime you commit, you will not be punished for it. Unless, and that's quite interesting, unless it affects the morale of the own troops. So that, of course, gives you blank check to do whatever you want. And yes, of course, you get some really weird people in the army, even in the German army, who like doing this and like misbehaving. But also think about, I don't know, being an 18-year-old conscript and you're ordered there, and you're brought in there, and then you're ordered to commit an atrocity. And I say, well, no, that's perfectly fine because, well, this is what the Führer said. It's one of the perverse things of Germany at that particular time, because you have this regime which is basically just evil. However, on paper, it was still a state of law, because the laws never get unhinged. They just pass new laws. And that's what they do. And this is one example. And the other very famous one is the Commissar Order, which comes on the 6th of June, 1941. And it's all about the communist commissars, so these political indoctrinators, let's call them, that were attached to the Soviet troops. And perhaps I'm just going to read it out because it gives you a very good idea about what is the meaning of it and the spirit of it. So it says, in the battle against Bolshevism, the adherence of the enemy to the principles of humanity or international law is not to be counted upon. In particular, can be expected that those of us who are taken prisoner will be treated with hatred, cruelty, and inhumanity by political commissars of every kind. The troops must be aware that, first, in this battle, mercy or considerations of international law is false. They are a danger to our own safety and to the rapid pacification of the conquered territories. And secondly, the originators of barbaric Asiatic methods of warfare are the political commissars. So immediate and unhesitatingly severe measures must be undertaken against them. They are therefore, when captured in battle, as a matter of routine, to be dispatched by firearms. So you take them to one side and you shoot them. So that really sets the tone right from the beginning. Yes, the Soviets also commit a lot of atrocities, but in many ways you have to say, of course, this is quid pro quo and they're repaying what the Germans have done. I mean, there are these, when you fast forward to 1942, 43, 44, these accounts from the Germans, well, we must win the war now, because if we lose the war, well, God help us, considering what we've done in the East. So it is warfare on an absolutely awful scale in every shape or form.
Indeed. Now let's take our podcast to its conclusion, more or less, and let's try to revisit the question, the historian's question of why did Barbarossa fail? Much is made in popular history, and people who kind of have a passing interest in history or have heard something about the Eastern Front or learned a bit in high school. Winter plays a huge role. This idea that the Germans failed because of the Russian weather, because it got cold. They weren't able to carry out their plans because of the cold. But I think that's mostly a myth. I mean, the cold, of course, contributed to damaging the Germans' ability to launch operations and so on in the later phase of the campaign, but I don't think it was decisive. I think we've got to look at other places to explain the German defeat. We've foreshadowed some of them, but why don't you take us through your view, Matthias, as to what are the core elements that lead to the German failure here?
I think it's definitely not the winter, as you've already said, because when winter really sets in, yes, the Germans are still advancing towards Moscow. But as I said earlier, the numbers are so small that the chance of seizing Moscow and bringing the war to an end by capturing Moscow are basically zero. So that wouldn't have happened. Logistics, we mentioned it. That is a massive problem that the Germans find. You've already mentioned it. There are times when German tanks just sit idle in the middle of nowhere because they simply don't have any petrol. So that is a huge, huge problem. The intelligence aspect that we also already talked about is very important. German intelligence was actually quite poor in World War II, particularly on the Eastern Front. Most of the time, they got it wrong. We already talked about the number of tanks. I think that's really indicative of what happened there. So they're not particularly good at that. But you also have, I think, perhaps what is the most important factor here in all of this is this idea of hubris. When you see what's happening on the German side, again, we need to put it into context. So in 1941, everybody in the world thought that the Soviet Empire was built on clay. As I already said, when you kick the door in, the whole rotten structure will come tumbling down. That was the general assessment by everybody. And now here you've got a German army that has just defeated France. And France was always seen as one of the main military powers in the world. And in the mindset of the Germans at that time, of course, if you go back to the First World War, because that's the frame of reference that they have, the Germans fought for 4 years on the Western Front and couldn't defeat the French. And now suddenly, in a campaign that only lasted 6 weeks, they did it. So they look at this now, the whole strategic situation. So if we could defeat this army that our fathers couldn't, or we, when we young lieutenants, couldn't defeat in a war that lasted 4 years, could defeat them in basically 6 weeks. Well, defeating Russia is going to be so easy. And this is where this whole hubris sets in. And when you look at the planning, particular things like the logistical resupply, it was all done on a shoestring. It was all on this hope, yes, well, they're going to collapse anyway. They're no good. Look at Finland. Look at how good we are. And this luck then runs out relatively quickly, you might say. And I would say this is the main point where the whole thing failed. So really, you might say, if you want to look at this, so if you have to write an essay about this at university, say Operation Barbarossa is a failure when they realized that they've won in France. Discuss.
Ooh, I like that. Kind of meta a little bit. And of course, I think the other overwhelming element here is the Soviet resistance and the ability of the Soviet state to continue in spite of all its flaws, its weaknesses, its corruption, its brutality, and the hit that it takes in June, July, and August. It doesn't collapse. The state doesn't collapse. The army doesn't collapse. The civilian population agrees to continue to support the war effort. This is where it's at. This is what is significant. There are tens of millions of Soviet citizens who don't like the system under which they live, who don't like Stalin, who don't like the way that this Stalinist communism impacts daily life and their quality of life and their freedoms of expression. There are tens of millions who hate this. And there was a great quote I came across from one volunteer for the Red Army who said, look, Kremlin bastards may come and go, but the motherland is forever. And so this threat to their homeland, to their community, be it local community or national community, or if they believe in the Soviet Union supranational community, it's there and it doesn't go away. And once it becomes clear, what kind of enemy the Germans are, they're not the Germans from 1914 to 1917 on the Eastern Front. They're a new kind of Germans. And that is a huge motivator. And that's one of the reasons why I think under conditions when most other armies would probably have been done, that the Soviets were not done and managed to survive to fight another day and survive to eventually win with help from the Western Allies, of course. And so on that note, I think we've drawn this one out. We've pushed the limits of podcasting and you lovely listeners' attention spans as far as we can for today. There's a lot more we could talk about 1941 and about the Eastern Front, and we will certainly do that in some future episodes. But that's what we could achieve for today. Thanks so much for listening. If you've got any comments or questions, or you don't agree with our analysis, for example, if you think we missed a wrinkle that you'd like to hear us explore, leave us a comment, send us an email, and we'll see you in the next episode. You've been listening to World War II, Both Sides of the Wire, a Battle Guide production. To support the creation of future episodes, consider joining our dedicated supporter community, where you can enjoy exclusive benefits and connect with like-minded individuals. For more information, please see the show notes, and if you appreciated this episode, please leave a review on your chosen podcast platform. Thank you for listening.
So, hang on. Sorry.
Gesundheit.
Dankeschön.
But also there were some suggestions from some generals, I should say. Well, I think that's one of the, I keep saying that's one of the interesting points. I mean, that's going to, of course, they're all interesting.
They're all interesting. That is perfectly okay.
I just don't want to keep repeating that. I mean,